Okay, I'm going to start now. Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my session. I see lots of friendly faces in the room, so try not to give me too much heat. I'm going to be as pragmatic as I possibly can, but as you can see, my employer is one of the world's biggest module makers. We have SIM cards, but I was told not to do a sales pitch, so I won't. So, what's the right solution for you? I talk on a daily basis. I've been doing this for 26 years, basically, making machines talk. I talk to clients about what they are trying to achieve. And ultimately, there's a lot of noise out there around network technologies, around network sunsets, deprecation, launches, what's going to work, what's not going to work, what technology is going to work with the server I want to use, with the SIM I want to use. So I'm going to try and guide you through a little 25-minute talk on the world as I see it, okay? And some of you may agree, some of you may not, and that's life. So, globalization. Let's talk a little bit about what that means. So, how many SKUs of device do you want to make? And of course, the dream is I want to make one thing in one factory. I just want to launch a product, and I just need it to work anywhere and everywhere in the world it can. And it seems the M&Os and the geopolitical situation is making that increasingly challenging, which is good news because it means we've all got jobs. But the bad news is it means we've got a lot of hard work we need to do and a lot of things we have to consider before we embark on a new project. Radio access type. So if you want to make one thing or something that's going to work around the world, which radio access technology do you use? And I seem to spend my life talking people out of whatever radio access choice they've made, and a choice that's mainly made based on commercials, because it's the cheapest one I can buy, okay? And the cheapest doesn't always mean it's going to work everywhere. It often means that it's the cheapest for a really, really good reason, okay? So don't just focus on the commercials of how much components cost, think broader on the total cost of ownership of your device and where you want to go and what you want to do. Do you need voice? I know it seems like a silly question, but there are people in this room right now who I know for a fact use voice technology over cellular. And you might hear CAT-M has voice capability. Well, that's marvelous, except there's basically no network operator in the world that has launched it, save for Swisscom, I think. So can you make a global device on CAT-M that uses voice? No, because you're not really going to get a global solution out of it. Okay? And then you have to consider other factors around voice. Do you want to use voice over LTE? Do you need 5G voice because somewhere you're deploying is embarking on a more 5G-centric evolution of their network infrastructure, somewhere like the USA, for instance? Or are you going to be using a SIP system, so your own voice over IP system? And these questions are quite important because it has a fundamental impact on the amount of intellectual property that you pay back to vendors like Qualcomm for use of that technology. So if you tell your module vendor, I want to use voice, then expect to pay a little more for the modem because there are IPR implications. If you're using a SIP system, it's all data, of course, so there are no IPR implications. Network sunsets. We all love a network sunset. It means we get to sell the same product to the same customer many, many, many times over the course of 20 years. Except it's a pain in the arse because it means every 5 to 10 years customers have to redesign their products and rethink absolutely everything. And it has a massive implication on globalization because different territories of the world are sunsetting their infrastructure at different rates. You've got the USA where people like AT&T are already talking about no longer certifying 4G devices, module makers' devices, not your devices. Okay, so at some point in the very near future, AT&T are going to say no more. We're not going to certify any more Cat1Bs, Cat1 devices for use on our infrastructure. It has to be 5G or CAT-M or above. Antenna complexity. So we talk about the difference between CAT-M and Cat1Bs and things like that. And of course, frequency bands. Is it sub-gigahertz? Or are we talking up to 2.6 gigahertz or even 3.5 gigahertz for 5G? You know, LTE was the big saving grace for the planet, except for the fact it made your antenna go from 5 bands to 45 bands. So it introduced massive complexity, which is really good news for the antenna manufacturers out there, but really bad news when it comes to ground plane design and things like that, because people still want to make things that are the size of a lanyard that have to work everywhere. So, of course, it's good news for antenna tuning companies and things like that. So we have to think a bit about the design when it comes to that sort of stuff. And then we've got certification, regulatory, M&O. So you're planning on using a roaming SIM? If you're using a roaming SIM, then you don't really have to go down the M&O certification route. You can just go regulatory in the US, right? You could get an FCC cert. You don't even really need PTCRB. You could go FCC and just launch with a roaming SIM card in America. How long your device might last is dependent on the operators and how much of their resources that you use, but you can do it, and people do it. In Europe, it's a little bit more flexible. In Australia, it's a little bit worse. So different regions, different issues. SIM choice. Are you going to go local MNO or roaming? And I was in a wireless logic chat this morning, and he was talking about SGP32, and of course, all these new eSIM solutions that are coming to the fore now really do play into the hands of MNO to MNO migration of communications, but of course that adds complexity to your design. It adds a need for potentially ongoing maintenance fees of a SIM card. And that brings into question whether or not you really need an eSIM or an EUICC, or whether you're just happy using a roaming SIM card that will just do what it needs to do. And then you've got difficult countries, like Turkey. I love Turkey as a holiday destination. But as a product launching destination, it's hideous, because if you're going to be there for more than 3 months, you're going to get booted off the network, not because of roaming issues, but because the local government, in conjunction with the network operators, mean that you have to either purchase your device or have it registered within the Turkish system in order for it to remain connected to the Turkish infrastructure. So you have roaming challenges, and UAE, United Arab Emirates, they don't really like roamers, and the costs go through the roof. Cat-M, narrowband, or Cat-1 biz? Big question. What should we do? I literally had a chat with somebody not 10 minutes ago down on the stand around this. Somebody told me they'd integrated our module and they'd used the Cat-M narrowband version. And I was like, why the hell did you do that? The problem is network and evolution and technology moves at breakneck pace. And really, the question comes down to, at its most basic level, is your device going to be above or below ground? Because narrowband IoT and Cat-M actually incorporate algorithms and techniques for retransmission that make them more suitable for below ground operation. Cat-1 biz, because it's a single antenna technology, potentially has a reduced link budget to the cell tower because it's single antenna. And that can be as much as 3 dBs, which is quite high, but then you may have a cell tower closer to your device that incorporates Cat-1 biz but doesn't incorporate Cat-M or narrowband IoT. So when we look at the paper, we look at the situation around comparing apples for apples, and it often isn't that simple. And a lot of customers now are migrating from what was commercially a more suitable technology maybe 5 years ago. Everyone went, oh God, 2G, 3G is being deprecated. What shall I do? Well, what's the next cheapest modem? Oh, well, M1 narrowband with 2G fallback. Well, that's great. Probably a lot of those devices are still on 2G. Okay? They're not even using Cat-M and narrowband IoT. They're still on 2G because the networks are still available. What it means is that a lot of that technology that was incorporated wasn't decided upon because it was necessarily the best technology, but because it was the best commercial choice at the time. And commercials move and cost points come down. And now we enter a situation where Cat-1 biz really is becoming on par with a Cat-M and narrowband device. So then you ask yourself, well, how much complexity do I want around my SIM card? Am I worried about how many network operators I have available in each country? Am I worried if the vendor I've chosen has got a roaming agreement with that Cat-M provider or that narrowband provider? Or how I integrate that technology into my application, or whether it has implications around latency and bandwidth which make me choose a different protocol altogether for how my device should work, because I can't do TCP, MQTT over narrowband IoT, because I can't guarantee it's going to work all the time. Cat-1 biz removes a lot of those barriers. It kind of makes it a bit more consumer-oriented again when it comes to SIM card choice. Power consumption, EDRX and PSM. I've had countless discussions with people around power consumption, because people love comparing modules with modules, and oh, yours is 0.1 of a milliamp less than this, and blah, 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 which yours is more than theirs, and all the rest of it. Data sheet top trumps, as I call it, which is never a good idea in my opinion. When it comes to EDRX and PSM, of course, if we're talking about roaming SIM cards, sometimes the roaming vendor doesn't even have access to the EDRX and PSM functionality of a network operator. They can roam onto the narrowband, but they can't access the power save modes. And that's a decision between that MVNO and the MNO, and you've got no control over that. Then you've got is it a static device or a mobile device? Because EDRX and PSM is useless in a mobile environment, so don't even consider it. It's not even a concern. And then you talk about, well, how are you actually using the modem? Are you doing what you've done for 25 years and turning it on, letting it register, transmitting a few bytes of data, checking the server for return packet, and switching it off again? Yeah. Okay, we don't need EDRX and PowerSave mode then, because you're just turning the modem off. And maybe you're doing that once a day, maybe twice a day. But in those circumstances, it doesn't make sense to even worry about that sort of technology, right? It's all about how you're using the tech. Mobility, as I just mentioned, which is useless for narrowband IoT. I know there are people out there, oh, you can do a cell reselection, or it's a faff. Just don't bother trying. You're better off using Cat 1 Biz. Region sunset coverage, yeah. So coverage issues. If we look at the UK at the moment, I spoke to somebody yesterday about this, and they said, oh, people want to know what's going on with the UK networks and the rollout of Cat M and narrowband and how we're getting on with it. And it is a bit of a dog's dinner, right? Because it doesn't matter what the network has rolled out. Have you even got access to it? Are they allowing roaming partners, or do you have to use a local SIM card from that vendor? It feels in a lot of ways like we've gone backwards. You know, 20 years ago, I could make a phone call at the top of the M1 and I'd still be on the person at the end of the M1. I mean, they died of boredom, but I was still on the same phone call, unbroken. These days, I can't make it 2 junctions without it cutting out, right? It just seems like a little bit backwards. And it certainly seems like networks are more data-centric than voice-centric these days. But for sure, the coverage on Cat M, for instance, if you look at O2's coverage maps, they are still having interoperability issues between different RAN architectures, especially down in the West Country, which means they probably can never support Cat M1 across the entire country ubiquitously, even through their whole network, because of the different vintages of RAN infrastructure and different vendors of RAN infrastructure that they've inherited over the years from the various murders and executions that they've done. Vodafone's narrowband network is pretty decent across the whole of the UK now, and for sure their Cat M network is well deployed as well. So I think on a balance, Vodafone's infrastructure is probably the best out of any of them when it comes to LPWA tech. But EE now coming up, right? So I've had customers who have mentioned that they've seen EE Cat M being rolled out, which is nice. They launched narrowband IoT about a year ago. Okay, now you look at what spectrum's being used, and yes, it's 1800 megahertz, which maybe for narrowband IoT and coverage enhancement isn't necessarily the best choice, but we have a choice in this country, right, of who we go with. But is there a SIM vendor out there that can provide you access to all of these network infrastructures simultaneously? Not easily, no. And you really don't want to be doing eSIM, flapping around different operators and downloading different profiles, because it creates more mess and issues than it actually does fix anything. Roaming, covered that. Bandwidth. So when it comes to latency, Cat 1 Biz followed by Cat M with narrowband IoT at the bottom is kind of the order of the pecking, okay? And Cat 1 Biz really has no latency issues, okay? It's got high bandwidth, which means the modem probably needs to be switched on for less time. And if you're doing a scenario where you're booting the modem up, letting it register, sending some data and switching it off again, you're probably going to do that faster on a Cat 1 Biz modem than you would on a narrowband modem because of the bandwidth capability and the latencies. But if you're below ground, then you might not get a signal. It's all a balance, right? Cat M, probably equally good as good as Cat 1 Biz if you've got a network cell tower anywhere near you that can do it, or a roaming agreement with a provider. And then narrowband IoT probably last when it comes to that scenario, okay? Because it really is designed for sensor data enablement, okay? Small data, small packets, UDP, almost obscurity when it comes to the security. Size of modem. So traditionally, narrowband and Cat M have been on the smaller side of the spectrum when it comes to your design, okay? And of course, the antenna complexity means that you're probably around either 800 or 900 megahertz, maybe 1800 megahertz, but your antenna design doesn't need to be that crazy, and the ground plane doesn't need to be mentally big as well. If we go into Cat 1 Biz, of course, we then open up the plethora of spectrum across LTE, okay? And whilst we don't need to worry about the carrier aggregation bands, we do need to worry about the main bands that the operators are supporting, which are well outside of the sub-gigahertz, okay, or even up to 2.3, 2.6 gigs. So it makes the antenna design a bit more complex for you. But then the rewards can be so much greater. So these are the things you have to really consider and think about when you decide on what tech it is you want to use. 5G RedCap. So this kind of is the new kid on the block, and if you've got a power consumption-centric application or something you actually want to have working today in the UK on 5G, probably isn't your best choice. So it's a release 18 standard, or release 17 standard actually, the first release, the initial release is release 17. eRedCap comes in release 18. Okay, it's the evolution. And this requires a standalone 5G infrastructure, which is, if you watched the guy at Wise Logic this morning, he mentioned that it requires essentially a RAN upgrade and a fundamental change on the infrastructure, which if we look at the world, is the sort of thing that the USA is now doing. So USA actually have 5G RedCap available today on their infrastructure. So why would somebody want to use it? Well, they'd want to use it if they were using Cat 4 or Cat 6 LTE in the United States of America, maybe making a gateway or a PSTN replacement device or something that isn't high bandwidth but needs access to new radio, 5G new radio implementation, but without the associated cost point of 5G. Okay, so that's why you'd want to use it, especially in a globalized sense. Now, what you'll find with most of these RedCap modules is they will also work on LTE. So there's also a 4G Cat 4 radio, global Cat 4 radio inside. So you could use it as a super expensive Cat 4 modem everywhere else in the world. And then it comes down to, do you want to make one thing or do you want to make two things? Okay, you could just have a 5G RedCap for America and then 4G for everywhere else. Okay. The initial release really is a dual antenna product. But the second release, they're talking about having single antenna. Okay, and they are talking about extending the power saving options. Now, will this replace Cat-M and narrowband IoT in the years to come? Maybe. At the moment, it's not intended to. Okay, Cat-M and narrowband IoT are intended to continue through the 5G era. Okay, and what we're seeing is from the network operators, especially in the USA, is that even when they move to a 5G standalone implementation, they're going to maintain a slither of spectrum, either band 12, band 13, whichever network operator it is you're using, so Verizon or AT&T, slither of spectrum with a 4G radio, RAN tower, connected to a 5G core, which is able to host Cat-M and narrowband devices still. So from a deployment sense, if you're looking at sort of a 10-year plus timescale, in the US, Cat 1 Biz is not a good option. Cat M1 is. Okay, but in Europe, Cat 1 Biz is a perfect option. 5G RedCap is probably your absolute safe house, but you'll pay through the nose for it. If you've got any questions, I don't mind taking them ad hoc. Do you really need an eSIM? So I'm guilty. Everyone's been guilty, I think, within every MVNO and probably MNO on Earth of overthinking it. Do you actually need an eSIM? What do you mean by eSIM? So eSIM can mean many things, right? So why? First off, is it insurance for the future? That's the dream, right? You make a product, you put a SIM card in, and in the future, I can put any provider's network, operator provider, into it I want, because that's the dream. Okay? And I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there that want to do that. What you have to consider in that scenario is that there are costs associated with the maintenance of what's called the bootstrap profile on that SIM card, which you will have an ongoing maintenance fee for. At some level, you will pay for that. Okay? It might be rolled into a data plan if you're using that particular vendor's data plan, so it can be somewhat hidden. But in the future, when you move away from that vendor and put some other vendor's plan in, the revenues are no longer going to that initial vendor, which means you will then have to start paying a maintenance fee for that SIM card to the original vendor, okay, because that bootstrap profile has to be maintained. and access to the server has to be maintained in order to provision and re-provision in the future. So consider the ongoing costs versus the return. If you're only going to save a couple of cents per device a year, then it's not worth doing, clearly, because you have to download to the product. If you're using a network radio access type which can't physically support the download of an e-profile, then don't ever expect it to work. Okay, so consider your radio access type and consider your need before you decide whether you really, really want an eSIM. And they are slightly more expensive than standard single profile SIM cards as well. You may want to overcome roaming challenges. You may want to bring your own connectivity store in. This is probably the most popular if you're a metering manufacturer, somebody like an Itron or a Landis & Gyr or someone like that, someone who makes hundreds of thousands of meters a year in a factory, and they just want to put a chip SIM down with no profile inside, a bit like an iPhone. It's a blank SIM inside the product, and on the factory floor they want to tell that SIM whose operator it's going to connect to forevermore. That's a super popular way of doing it, and that's a factory provisioning, not a remote provisioning solution. And in that circumstance there is no maintenance fee to pay. There's an initial profile loading fee, but that is it. It means you can make one thing in droves and then decide on the end of the production line whose operator you want to put in. And usually these are local MNOs. You may want to have a B2B to C. What the hell do you mean by that? So business to consumer. So if you're making, and I had a chat recently with an electric car charging point maker, and they were saying, we put a 4G modem in. They're using Simcom at the moment. No one's perfect, but they put a 4G modem in, and we want to, you know, some customers want it and some customers don't. But we don't want to enable that SIM card unless we absolutely have to, and we don't even want to pay for it. We want the customer to pay for it. Can you help me? It's like, no way, mate. Sorry, that's not our bag. What they want is essentially a billing entity who can bill their end customer and not them for using that SIM card. So there are many reasons. And of course, bomber logistics, as I mentioned, making something in droves. Or, and I see my colleague Simon walked in, or, I just don't want the user to be able to remove the SIM. You don't need an eSIM, you just need a chip SIM. Or, I need to put a conformal code on my device. I'm totally happy with the SIM contract I have. I'm happy using whatever I'm using today. I just don't want to have a removable SIM card anymore, or I want to cover it in resin, right? Or I just want a solderable component. It's important to ask why you want an eSIM and what you mean by an eSIM. I mean, the good news is all this is possible. It's just about having the right discussion. NTN. Not technically now. So, who's heard of NTN? Excellent, good. The marketing engine's in full swing. I think we're about there on the hype curve at the moment, so it's going to start getting real soon. I see the guys on Nordic Standard talking about it. We can talk about it. Everyone can talk about it. Can anyone deliver anything yet? No, not really. Anything really useful. And you've really got to look at what you want to use it for. Do you want to make video calls? Because that's not really what this version of NTN is for. There is an NTN, it's also called NTN, they're all called NTN, which is part of the Release 18 standard, which comes in on 5G. So there's new families of 5G modems based on, I think it's the SDX 82 and 85 series, which are capable of supporting high bandwidth NTN applications. But the types of systems that you'll see inside the Nordic chip or inside the Sony Altair chip or inside the Qualcomm chip, these are more narrowband centric. These are a bit like satellite text messages. So very low data throughput, okay? And if you look at the per megabyte cost, astronomical. But you're not really going to be using megabytes. You're going to be using very small packets of data. So we have to look at the constellations as well, because you've got low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and geostationary. And of course, geostationary is probably where most folks are at the moment, with people like Skylo. These are satellites which are a bit like your Sky satellites. These are on the horizon if we're here in the UK. They're about 23 degrees off the horizon. And the idea being that you can use your existing antenna, okay? And you just need to make sure your device is somewhat located outdoors, because you've got to be able to see the sky, because it's a satellite. So if it's underground down a manhole, you need to make sure your antenna is at least outside the manhole. Okay, if it's indoors, then forget it, right? It's got to be outdoors. You also have to have a GPS position. What do you need the GPS position for? It needs to know where it is, so you use the correct satellite for licensing and the correct spectrum. So you still have to have GPS, an accurate location, okay, before you can use it. And I pushed back on this, my part. I was like, what the bloody hell do you need GPS? Surely you can do cell triangulation or something. It needs to be a rough position. But no, it needs to be GPS, apparently. I did try hard. But the LEO and the MEO, of course, these satellites are mobile, a bit like the GPS satellites, okay? Which means you're going to then have to start worrying about things like azimuth and elevation and velocity, the sort of ephemeride information that you have to worry about with GPS receivers. And then you think about your antenna, and then you think about satellite handover. And it increases complexity quite a lot. But with the LEOs and the MEOs, you can get higher bandwidth. With the GEOs, it's typically lower because they're much further, okay? Antenna and spectrum. So there's L band, there's S band, there's lots of different bands just to make the antenna guys happy. Hopefully you won't need an antenna like that because it kind of makes it not really IoT anymore. I'd love to sell you some, by the way. You know, I'm sure they're quite expensive. But yeah, antenna and spectrum is something to worry about. And of course, what provider are you going to go with? Because there are loads out there. There's loads of noise. I mean, got Starlink talking about doing something with T-Mobile in the US on Band 25 on Cat 1Bs. Well, that's amazing, but how the hell do we use that in Europe? It's T-Mobile in America have got the agreement with Starlink. Who's got the agreement with Starlink in the UK? How do we use it? Interoperability. You want to use Skylo today, Starlink tomorrow. Do these things just work? No, of course they don't just work. Nothing just works. Okay, so as I say, hype cycles here, and we need to be really careful about what we decide upon right now today. And then your subscription. So, do you want it to work as a narrowband Cat-M modem and an NTN modem? Because you're going to need to worry about what SIM profiles you've got on your SIM card. Because you're going to need a profile for NTN, you're going to need a profile for land-based cellular subscription. How are you going to do the handover? How are you going to decide what you're going to use today? And it's funny because I looked at the cost, and I looked at some of the pricing per megabyte for the Skylo stuff, and it was like $200, and I'm like, yeah, give me some of that, no worries. And of course, you're never going to use megabytes, right? It's packets of data. But if you compare it to what's available today and what people have to use today, people like Iridium modems and the subscriptions for those, actually the costing for NTN in a narrowband Cat-M modem, you could probably just discard the Cat-M and narrowband bit and just use it as an NTN radio. Right? Because it's a pretty low-cost solution to the problem with a subscription. And we hear that people like Flow Live now are in collaboration with Skylo, so we're going to start seeing SIM cards available from those guys. There are a lot of the core networks out there are provided by Flow Live, so we see a lot of interoperability capabilities coming to the fore when it comes to this stuff, but not today. So, 2 minutes to go. I'm quite impressed with myself, actually. I've finished almost on time. Didn't think I would. So, any questions from anybody? If you're too worried to raise your hand now, then come down and see us in booth H1. We're right at the bottom of the steps below the toilets. So, here's the team, left to right. But any questions at all from anybody about anything I've said? Does anybody disagree? Always like a good challenge. Yes, sir. Yes, NTN limitations.
For IoT, assuming that you're sending messages like... Can you hear me? Okay.
Do you know any songs?
For IoT, assuming you're sending messages like once or twice a day.
Yes.
With Skylo, for example.
Yes.
Isn't this like perfect? Because you're not talking about megabytes, you're talking about bytes or kilobytes. Of
course.
So are there any limitations?
No.
Okay.
Other than you can't get it today.
Can you not?
Well, the thing is you've got to, where's your subscription coming from? Can you get a SIM card today for Skylo that's going to work with a cellular modem vendor's product? Unless you're talking about a standalone Skylo product, which you can buy today, of course. What I'm talking about, I'm coming from a cellular modem standpoint, emerging into the NTN world. But of course, NTN's been available for years when you're not using cellular or the 3GPP standard. But no, there are no limitations other than the fact that yeah.
Okay, thank you.
It will just work as long as you can see the satellite. That's the problem. You've just got to be able to see the satellite. But yeah, I saw a demo the other day of it working, which is really nice. The problem is that there are no AT commands on a modem that support it yet, so it was through the QXDM interface. So it was like a blink and you miss it scenario if anyone's ever used that interface on a Qualcomm device before. But what we're talking about is probably towards the end of this year, unless my learned friend at Sony LTE can give me any better news. Probably towards the end of this year when it comes to firmware availability and actual usability of this stuff through a cellular modem provider. So I've probably created more questions and answers. If you'd like to come and talk to us, come down to the stand here for the next day and a half. So thank you very much.